Every village was dominated by its church, and the peasants' social life revolved around it. The medieval church certainly knew how to attract a congregation. It was the place where the peasants had their parties, where they did their amateur dramatics, and where they even held football matches. Oh, and the local priest often used to brew his own beer, which is certainly more of a draw than playing the guitar. And the church expected its peasants to be duly grateful. Here in Painswick, Gloucestershire, a rather quaint ceremony has survived from medieval times. Peasants would show their love of the church by giving it a big hug.
Well, welcome everyone to this year's clipping service. I think we have our arms right the way round the church. And so now we're going to embrace, or we're going to clip our lovely church.
Another reason they were so fond of the church may have been that it provided plenty of holidays, or rather, holy days. If you thought we have more leisure time today, think again. Nowadays, we enjoy 8 public holidays a year. In the Middle Ages, the church insisted on 80. Well, a clearer picture of peasant lifestyle seems to be emerging. But I wanted to really get under their skin, so I was introduced to some real-life medieval peasants. Far from being sickly and diseased, forensic studies have revealed that the inhabitants of a remote Yorkshire village received surprisingly sophisticated health care. What about this chap here? We've got a skull with a big hole in the middle of it.
Right, well, this is absolutely extraordinary. What this seems to be is a cranial injury that was treated by neurological surgery. This individual suffered a blunt injury to the head just around the time of the Norman Conquest. Where this hole is, that would have been where the bone was shattered into small fragments. And if you look carefully at this, you can see where the surgeon made his incisions.
Really? The guy's been hit on the head, and the surgeon said, I've got to get rid of those pieces of fragments of skull. They knew that was bad to have the fragments of skull.
Exactly, yes.
So this guy's wandering around with a hole in his head.
Oh, yes, yes. I mean, this would have been covered by his scalp.
What a bit of skin would have grown over it.
Oh, yes, yes, exactly. Yes, he wouldn't have had a hole right through to the brain. And he'd been perfectly all right with it.
The bones reveal that some peasants lived well into their 60s, and whilst there are signs of malnutrition, their diet did have its benefits.
One of the upsides is that they did have quite good dental health. There is very little tooth decay, and we can see
That's
here,
because they're not having sugar and stuff like that.
they're not having sugar, and also it's a very coarse diet, which is tend to scour the teeth clean.
Yeah.
And we can see this here, and that means that there's no chance for dental decay to get started.
But a toothbrush still wouldn't have gone amiss in some cases.
If we look at this one here, as you can see, these huge shaggy deposits on the teeth.
Oh, it's disgusting.
Right, well, this is actually mineralised dental plaque. This has accumulated over the years of his life. And that shows quite clearly there's no effort at oral hygiene amongst these people.
Oh, God, he must have had terrible breath. Chronic halitosis seems to have been a bit of an issue. In Wales, a peasant woman could divorce her husband on the grounds of bad breath. Clearly, they weren't stupid. And historians now believe that the peasant class wasn't as ignorant as was once assumed either. It was all about getting your child in the right school, which in the Middle Ages meant being snapped up by the church. Village priests often taught the sons of villagers their ABC, and perhaps 1 in 10 of these boys would go on into the clergy. Some sons of peasants went on to become high-flying members of the intelligentsia, like this chap here, William of Wickham. William may have been born a humble peasant, but he rose to become the richest and one of the most powerful men in England. He was Lord Chancellor not once, but twice, and he put his fortune to good use. He founded this place, one of the oldest public schools in the country, Winchester College. Oh, very nice. William never forgot his origins, and he established this school to provide education for 70 boys from peasant backgrounds. Not so many peasants around here nowadays, but William's cryptic motto still hangs above today's pupils. Aut disce, aut discede. either learn or go. And then he adds, there is a third choice: be beaten. But we should be clear that literacy wasn't sought after by the peasants so they could do a spot of bedtime reading or improve their crossword skills. What they wanted was to be able to make out enough words in Latin to check references to themselves and their land in the court rolls. And checking court documents was something that was going to come in very useful for the peasants in the tumultuous times that lay ahead. For most of the 13th and early 14th century, England had an almost Mediterranean feel. Bumper crops and a booming economy, and the population doubled. But then that old enemy of the English struck. No, I don't mean the All Blacks, I mean the weather. Heavy rain and low temperatures caused crops to rot and entire villages to sink. People were starving to death. Surely it couldn't get any worse than this. But it could. On top of the famine came something even more dreadful: the Black Death. An already weakened population was devastated. To many people, it seemed that God had deserted them, and they struggled to reconcile this terrible catastrophe with their beliefs. Here in the church at Ashwell in Hertfordshire, the plague has left its mark, quite literally. Over 650 years ago, the desperate local priest scratched these words onto the walls of his bell tower. You can see here, it says, Primula Pestis, the first plague, 1349. And then below, he's incised into the walls in deep letters, a big M, that's 1,000. And then 350. In 1350, he puts Miseranda ferox e violenta. Miserable, fierce, and violent the plague has been. And then below he writes, the dregs of the population are left behind to bear witness, and a mighty wind thunders across the world. The Black Death was a catastrophe. But ironically, those who survived found they were better off than they ever had been. You see, the population of England had been almost halved, and labour was scarce, and ordinary farm workers suddenly found they were in a position to call the shots. Peasants began to refuse to fulfil their feudal duties. They started to negotiate wage increases and even began to be paid in hard cash. Some left their manors and acquired their own free land. All this, of course, got up the noses of the aristocracy. If there was more wealth around, they saw no reason why the peasants should have it. So they introduced laws to restore compulsory labour and force wages back down to the levels before the Black Death. But what seems to have especially irritated the aristocracy was the way the peasants were dressing. This season's peasant ditched drab workwear in favour of bright colours, tighter hose and even fur. Some peasants were spending almost the same on clothes as certain noblemen. So laws were introduced dictating what different classes could wear. For example, for any person below the level of craftsman, pointy shoes were a fashion crime. Literally. All of which stoked the fires of peasant resentment. The final straw was when the barons imposed a poll tax to pay for their war in France. This was bitterly resented because it meant that everybody had to pay the same, rich or poor. And to make matters worse, the government got its sums wrong. They based their calculations on the population size before the Black Death. So when they failed to raise the amount they expected, they imposed a second poll tax. And that was when the unthinkable happened. The peasants took up arms and revolted. From all over England, they converged on Canterbury and marched to London, maybe as many as 60,000 of them. With no emails or mobile phones, how could the peasants have organised all this? Could it be that they were making use of their newly acquired literacy to spread word of the revolt? Two of the chroniclers record what they claim were letters that the peasants were circulating amongst themselves. Now, the letters are written in English, but they're very cryptic, and we don't really know what they mean. But it could be that they contain detailed, coded instructions for the revolt. This is the one in Thomas Walsingham's Chronicle. And you can see here it says, John Sheep greeteth well John Nameless and John the Miller, and biddeth them chastise well Hob the Robber, and look, shape you to one head and no more. Knoweth your friend from your foe, have it enough, and say who. Now, it may be that when it says, chastise well Hob the Robber, those are instructions to the peasants not to do any looting, and only to destroy documents and records. And then it says, look, shape you to one head and no more. Well, it could be just instructions saying, just only have one leader. But on the other hand, it may be instructions to go on pilgrimage to Canterbury, where the peasants assembled first. And the focal point was the head of Thomas à Becket. And finally it says, knoweth your friend from your foe, and say who. These could be absolute rigid instructions to distinguish your friends from your enemy by the battle cry.
The climax of the Peasants' Revolt must rank as one of the most extraordinary scenes in history. Tens of thousands of rebelling peasants confronted the country's aristocracy, led by the king, a 14-year-old boy. The peasants' leader, Wat Tyler, rode towards the boy king to make his demands, and then took a swig from a jug of ale, whereupon the mayor of London charged and cut him down. It looked as if the huge throng were about to attack the aristocracy, but the king suddenly rode forward and shouted, I'll be your leader, follow me! The king granted the peasants pardons and promised to abolish serfdom. But once the rebels had dispersed, the barons quickly set about slaughtering the ringleaders. Thousands of peasants died. The peasants' revolt failed. However, the ideal of freedom and of owing deference to no one was a lasting legacy of the medieval peasant. But there's a sting in the tail to the peasant story. The lords realised that if the peasants were now free from any labour obligation to them, they were likewise free from any obligation to care for their peasants. The social consensus of the feudal system had broken down. And there was worse to come. Peasants were about to come face to face with their real enemy, sheep. You see, your average lord could make more money out of sheep than he could out of peasants. And for a start, there's a lot more wool on a sheep, and you can eat them, which is possible with peasants, but socially tricky. So the lords started to throw the troublesome and uneatable peasants off the land and replace them with these chaps. The social landscape of Britain changed forever. There's nothing intrinsically terrible about the peasant's life. In fact, there were times in the 14th century when it was pretty fine. It deteriorated when the lords fenced in the land, and it got even worse in the Industrial Revolution. And small farmers are still up against it. The life of the peasant depends on the society. But it's sobering to think that compared to a lot of people's lives today, some medieval peasants had it pretty good.